So I'll be presenting this on behalf of my colleagues who couldn't be here, Karen Raven and Tom Goddard. Tom owes me one, but this is a project that we've been working on now for, unbelievably, it's been 1.5 years since we started on this, and there's a number of individuals, other individuals who have been, certainly key to this, but essentially this was Alberta Agriculture was asked to take the lead on this Southeast Alberta, or on a conservation offset pilot in the South Saskatchewan region, which we'll describe a little bit more fully in a minute. Essentially the area that is currently under the development for a regional plan, and we'll kind of provide the context for that and why we chose Southeast Alberta. First, a little bit about what an offset is, and I think most of the people in this room would probably understand this. We're familiar with the carbon offset. Essentially, it's compensatory actions that would address and I guess the key there is unavoidable ecological losses in this case. So with regard to a conservation offset or a biodiversity offset, during the process of development, the idea is that you need to take every step that that would be available to you to avoid making an impact on the environment, obviously. So there are those best practices, and so there's that. We talk about the mitigation hierarchy, and so these would be the unavoidable losses that are still there. We can look at offsetting. The provincial legislation, which is the Alberta Land Stewardship Act. Most farmers are very aware of this. Bill 36, it's caused a lot of controversy out in the country, particularly in southern Alberta, but it's the provincial legislation that enables the development of regional plans, associated management frameworks, and within that act as well is the enabling of things like conservation offsets and other conservation tools as well. Suffice to say that policy options are being considered by Alberta government, and so obviously this offset was something that was felt to be a good idea to try some of these things on the ground. These policy tools that are within ALSA and used for planning were highlighted in the recent consultation for the Regional Advisory Council, and basically in blue there you can kind of see that advice that was coming to government. That GOA needs to develop those enhanced suite of conservation and stewardship tools. Things like economic and market-based incentives, things like conservation easements. We have conservation easements, but to look at those in the context of particularly private land, but not only private land either, but certainly things like mitigation banking was also highlighted, and we'll kind of come back to that a little bit here, perhaps, if we have time at the end. So why did we choose Southeast Alberta? And Ross Mackenzie kind of highlighted this a little bit yesterday, that here's the 6 horsepower unit going on the Lethbridge Research Center about probably 100 years ago. But essentially, very early in settlement, we lost a lot of our grasslands, a lot of the more productive farmland, or a lot of the most productive grasslands were put under the plow very early. And then add to that, over the last 50 years, very considerable energy development in the region, to the point where we have, some would argue, well, that's still a good news scenario because we have 40% of that area remaining in the dry mixed. But most of those areas are fragmented to a certain extent, and just an example of that, these are just the points which would indicate oil and gas activity down in the southern part of the province, and you can kind of see over in the areas, in terms of the eastern areas of this region where there's very significant activity. That has an impact, and it's having an impact, I guess, increasingly really on some of the wildlife and plant species in the region. And right now we have the sage grouse is shown here, the one that's probably the most endangered, but there's actually 19 different species that are listed in terms of being species of concern, species at risk, that we need to account for because of our international obligations, federal obligations, and obviously provincial obligations. So So I guess, yeah, that's sort of why we looked at southern Alberta. So hopefully you can see that. So basically this is the area that we chose for the pilot, and essentially the pilot area would be defined by the area to the east of this transition between the dry mixed and the moist mixed grasslands. So essentially this area of sort of the southeast Alberta, that's the area where we have most of our species at risk. And so we said, well, let's, if we're going to do an offset related to conservation or biodiversity, this is a pretty good area to start with. And you can kind of see within that area, the green areas being the areas of remaining native prairie. The lighter green color would be areas that are under private ownership, and so a very significant portion of this is in public ownership. What we've done is we've approached industry to say we have an opportunity to collaborate and learn on something here. So we're looking at a voluntary offset, which is above and beyond their current regulatory requirements of their impacts for new development on native prairie within that area. So that entire area. And we've said we'll offset that with an agricultural offset, which is a conversion of cropland to a native species mix. And we'll target that down into this area in more the extreme southeast, where at least initially in this offset pilot, because there's obviously with things like species with sage grouse, for example, being a particular concern in that area, but the other 18 species that we listed there as well. For those converted lands, the focus is basically converting those to a native species mix that would be used as rangeland for grazing. So our pilot objectives then, basically we're looking at a practical science-based approach to quantify those development site requirements. So in any of these offset approaches, so if anyone's familiar with carbon, you need to have a stewardship unit, so we're talking about CO2 equivalent. So we've been working with the idea of a habitat hectare equivalent, and so working out those metrics in terms of when someone goes on site with new development, what would that quantity of offset be that you require? Then on the second objective is then looking on the agricultural offset side, optimizing those conservation benefits, and looking at, this is obviously a market-based approach, so we'll talk a little bit about that. Third point being exploring ways that we can look at price discovery. So, in terms of incentives for conversion, we could look just at a set price, but we're going to explore some other options there in the case of this pilot. And then demonstrating the role for a third party to facilitate these transactions, a little bit like the mitigation bank approaches that are used in the US. And we think a third party approach is something that's going to work a lot better in terms of some of these conservation offsets. So in terms of that, quantifying that offset requirement, and I guess the point of this slide really is to say that not just the petroleum industry, but mineral extraction or sand and gravel, wind, utilities. So we want to develop a workable but scientifically defensible approach that largely includes all the potentially adverse effects of new development. And we've sort of split that into two parts. We've been collaborating with the energy industry, with CAP, and a number of the sort of on-the-ground players in the region here. And we've got a document which is listed there, developed by Kevin France with ESRD and Ron McNeil, which looks at offset ratios, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The premise of that is it's based on reclamation success, and that falls out of the long-term monitoring and research that's been done. Just one of those documents on the right there with the express pipeline that's run, the Alta link there, the express pipeline, and the work that was done to look at reclamation success. So ratios that essentially we have the grassland vegetation inventory. Is everyone kind of familiar with the grassland, with GVI, grassland vegetation inventory? It's a terrific inventory that we have that kind of builds on our agricid soil resources that we have in the southern region. And essentially, we're looking at the the native natural class within GVI, those upland classes, and there's 14 of them. And so our ratios largely build off of those site types within GVI. And so most of our, we're approaching a stage now when most of the grassland region of Alberta will have good GVI coverage. And so I think this is kind of a workable approach, obviously for our pilot, but even as we step up to the grasslands in the future with an offset program. So basically, what that does within GVI, those landscape types, essentially the build on the soil resource in terms of what are those site types. So when a industry development would be occurring then on, again, this is voluntary, we don't have any industry signed up at this point. We've been working this winter with the industry to get signed up, but essentially when, if and when they do sign up, they'll basically agree to offset ratios based on these particular site types on the landscape. So the second part of that is looking at some of those additional impacts, obviously ecological impacts that relate to the type of disturbance, the type of access required, things like structure, height, and or depth, things like noise and permanence. These are a bit more challenging to have, I guess, a defensible and yet straightforward enough approach to offset these types of things. And so again, we're working with industry. We haven't quite got this one figured out, but again, it's very important to do that collaboratively with industry, and we're making some headway, and we think within the next probably 4 to 6 weeks should arrive at something that would be manageable. Again, not that Alberta government necessarily signs up to say that this is ultimately what we're going to end up with, but it's an approach that should work. Once we've then determined that offset, how do we find that? So we find that offset over on agricultural lands. We're looking here at a voluntary landowner commitment, which would be assured through a contract agreement. So we're not looking at going out and purchasing those lands, but basically it's like a lease, essentially. So the landowner agrees to a certain contract length to convert that annual cropland in this initial phase. There are obviously other offset opportunities, but in this case, in the initial phase, an agreement to put that land into a native species mix for a period of time, sort of in that 10 to 15 year range, or perpetuity, and we'll be negotiating price based on the contract length. So that offset also needs to target lands that are optimal for native species habitat suitability. And so, and I guess the premise here being, when you look down into that landscape, just see you can see some of the annual cultivation that remains interspersed within large areas of native rangeland. I think the premise here is, and we recognize that right from the start, that not all of those cultivated lands would have the same habitat value if converted back to a native mix. And so we've developed a process that where we've arrived at what we think is a pretty defensible habitat suitability index that applies to that entire landscape, basically to the cultivated parcels within that landscape. And you can see it here. Essentially, that's to identify and prioritize those areas that will provide the offset. I'm down to 5 minutes. We're good. And a defendable, clear, consistent, and objective approach for prioritization as well. So that suitability index has 17 different criteria. And for example, I've just listed a few of them, but it would be areas that are proximal to native prairie, particularly native prairie blocks, things like riparian and water bodies, proximal to critical species habitat, ungulate, winter, and range. So not just species at risk type issues, but other features. And then obviously you're discounted somewhat in that index for things like areas with existing development pressure or more productive or irrigated land. So obviously we're trying to target those parcels that are perhaps more marginal. So in a sense, landowners would get some benefit, if you will, or there would be some benefit in terms of providing offset for lands that are perhaps more marginal in nature. So in terms of price discovery then, a reverse auction, We're looking at a bid type approach here. And the idea here is that going forward, there needs to be an approach with these offsets where we're getting the least cost per offset unit. And it's really that relationship between that bid price and habitat suitability index. And we're, again, working collaboratively with landowners. We've been meeting with landowners. We've had 5 or 6 meetings with landowners down in the area to kind of work through some of these things. There's a bit of a distaste for a bid type approach, just tell us what you're going to pay us. But I think we've convinced them that this is an approach that we need to take. And we've got some guys on the land that are sort of going to be hopefully champions for this to move this forward. And then there's that third-party facilitator part, which we think is really important, working with the landowners and the industry and trying to keep these transaction costs for offsets down, but having that third-party facilitator involved. We're fortunate down in this area to have the multi-species at-risk staff on the ground, so that's whom we've chosen for this pilot as our third party. And essentially they'll be doing those transactions. They'll be, evaluating those sites in terms of plant community seed mix, kind of the quality control on these habitat developments essentially is pretty important. And then managing those offset obligations, holding the contracts and tracking management costs in terms of what we can learn from this pilot. And this is no small task, and we've been negotiating and working with our partner on this to try and keep those transaction costs down, basically, because we know that that's important. So as a summary then, offsets will be coming to Alberta as part of the management frameworks within our regional plans where, for example, we have objectives like things like no net loss of native prairie and no net ecological loss or biodiversity losses on native prairie in southern Alberta. And so offsets are a tool that will be used in the future. We need to learn. And so we want to demonstrate the potential for that in a fairly practical way. It's become a little bit of a black hole. This is challenging stuff, and you realize why people haven't been doing these pilots, but it's certainly been very interesting. Obviously, it's voluntary and convincing industry to get involved above and beyond what their regulatory requirements are, and a very collaborative approach. And a number of folks involved in this, and I need to highlight, obviously, our sister ministry, Environment Sustainable Resource Development, extremely involved in this one. Agriculture is kind of taking the lead, but they've been providing the expertise here in terms of the ecology. ABMI, Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, ACA, we mentioned, University of Calgary is involved, Cormac Gates. Alberta Innovates Technology Futures, leading a lot of what's happening in terms of offset policy development within the province. That's Marion Weber, who's involved with our team. And Ron McNeil has been extremely helpful. We've had him under contract, Landwise Inc. He's been invaluable.